Sid, thank you so much, Roland and Greg, for being with us tonight. And I'll hand over to Roland.
Well, Sarah, thanks very much indeed for sort of sorting things out. It's a real pleasure for me to be here with Greg, who's an author who I've worked with in my capacity as publishing director at Michael Joseph imprint at Penguin Books for what, nearly the last 10 years, Greg. It was sort of early 2010s, wasn't it, that we first started working together, and then published Orphan X, the first in the series that you're currently writing in 2016. But I say it's a pleasure because as editor, it's actually a much rarer treat than you would imagine to have a new manuscript deliver from one of your authors and have the luxury of reading it as a fan, as a punter, rather than as somebody who is kind of keeping an eye out for potential sort of pitfalls and problems on every page that's turned. I get that opportunity once a year with Greg when he delivers his manuscript, and it is always a sort of a pure joy to read it from beginning to end. I always know I'm in very, very safe hands. So for that, Greg, thank you. I'm just going to do a quick précis. I'm sure all this is on the website, but you studied at Harvard and Oxford. You're a New York Times best-selling novelist in the US and #1 bestseller here in the UK. You've been a showrunner for a major network sci-fi series. You recently had a hit Netflix movie starring Jason Momoa. You've written comics like Batman, Punisher, and Wolverine for Marvel and DC. And you've been a guest lecturer at UCLA as well. You come from a medical family, I think, don't you? So was all this a great disappointment to your parents?
Well, yeah, I come from a Jewish medical family, so the disappointment was double, Roland. So I didn't realize we'd be opening on such a sore subject. No, it was, it took some adjusting, I think. I mean, I don't come from a family where people are in creative fields or artistic endeavors, family of lawyers and doctors. And so it was a little bit odd, but the only thing I ever wanted to do is write books. I mean, so it just was, I thought in stories, and I thought that if you were a passionate reader, that everybody would want to write books who was a passionate reader. And I didn't discover that. I was a little bit older. My sister actually reads even more than I do. And at a certain point, I think I was in I must have been 10 years old. I asked her when she was going to write her first book, and she looked at me like I was crazy. I didn't understand that you could just love reading and taking in stories without wanting to write and create them yourself. So.
Yeah, I mean, you have made that kind of exploration of stories. I mean, as a reader and an academic, as well as a writer, your sort of life's work. I mean, you studied Shakespeare as an undergraduate and for your master's, and your thesis, I learned last week, was on Freudian and Jungian analysis of Shakespeare's Pericles. Which would seem inevitably to lead to a thriller about a serial killer's escape from an extreme high security jail, and your second book about a team of Navy SEALs tackling monsters in the Galapagos Islands. I mean, does that
also fun fact, Roland? Yeah. That thesis was also a #1 Sunday Times bestseller. Little known fact. So the Freudian and Jungian analysis of Shakespeare's Pericles just blew off the shelves.
Yeah. I mean, we couldn't print them fast enough. It's I'm imagining there's a copy there in the Bodleian Library.
I'm sure.
But I mean, there's a sort of serious question behind that. I mean, that's in that all of those things that you studied have at their heart, obviously, storytelling. They wouldn't have persisted. They wouldn't have survived to be part of the canon if that were not the case. Why or how is it that you decided that where your kind of passion for storytelling was going to take you kind of into a direction that actually is not use the sort of shorthand, a literary direction, but in a commercial one, and feel the thrillers in particular?
Well, so two parts to that question. The first, I would say, I only studied what I loved, and there was no pattern to it when I was doing it. I got obsessed with Freud. I got obsessed with Jung. And then later on looking at it, it's obvious, like Freud's case studies essentially are these beautiful short stories, right? And they're thrilling. They involve all sorts of mayhem and fantasy and destructive tendencies, and they're neatly resolved with the narrative structure. And Jung, of course, wrote about nothing but story, whether he was writing about alchemy or the archetypal unconscious, right, or archetypal narratives. And so everything that I did, I kind of just jumped into anything that grabbed my fancy. And then in hindsight, as I look back, it seems like it had this very natural order. Part of that included would be Shakespeare. You know, that's what I studied at Trinity. And it's interesting because Shakespeare's works in so many ways are primarily commercial, right? Yeah. They're these highly structured, convention-bound, narrative-driven tales of lust, intrigue, and murder, right? And the fault of the character, you know, the part of what drives the stories is some fault that's embedded in the character, right? That's what determines what is narrative versus real life, let's just say. And, you know, Shakespeare, it's not like he was devoting himself to preserving his plays and preserving his place in the literary tradition. He was trying to just put asses in chairs and sell out the Globe Theater, right? So he was always sure, if you slice the Globe Theater in half, it's a perfect cross section of Elizabethan society. And he would have, you know, a glancing reference to Ovid's Metamorphosis for the people in the high seats. And then he would make, you know, a real puerile sexual innuendo joke for the groundlings. He was trying to entertain everybody. And what commentary he had about, you know, when he had social commentary, he was, of course, threading that through the conventions and tendencies and the likes and dislikes of the ruling parties. It's very similar. I had an interesting conversation with a friend of mine out here who's a screenwriter, and we were talking about how you try and navigate and get something through the Hollywood system intact, where it's actually saying something interesting when there's so much pressure to make things conform, right? To make things more typical. And we were joking about it. And I was saying, look, not like comparing our work to this, but it's like people had to go and get the sponsorship of the Medicis, right? Like people had to get things that were through. So whatever theme Shakespeare was working into Henry V had a particular shape for a particular reason that was relevant to him being able to put it on. And so he was constantly figuring out how to get his work funded, how to get a wide audience, and how to appeal to everybody from top to bottom in the culture. And so that's very similar. In some ways, it's much more similar to commercial fiction, I think, in some ways, than it is to aspects of what we call like more specific academic literary writing, let's say.
No, it's interesting you mentioned the sort of passing references to Ovid's Metamorphosis or something in a Shakespeare play, because one of the things which struck me about the novels you write, and one of the things actually which is always a source of great pleasure when I spot them, and more as often I don't, are the little asides, little references to the Easter eggs, if you like, for readers who have have sort of knowledge to spot them. As I said, I miss them, I think, probably more often than I get them until they're pointed out to me by you, like your set of bad guys in the new manuscript, each of whom is characterizing one of the 7 deadly sins. I mean, I can now see, I was going to ask whether there was a sort of precedent for that in the books that you loved, and you've sort of volunteered it already. But beyond that, I was wondering, you talked about structure that sort of informs what Shakespeare does, or indeed what Jung or Freud does as well. Do you find that structure in what you're doing more helpful than hindrance? Having something to kick against rather than just flying completely free, is that a good thing for you?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's interesting because structure out here, I'm in Los Angeles, right? So there's a lot of screenwriting classes. And the one thing they always teach is structure, in some ways, because it's the one thing that can be most effectively taught. Mm-hmm. Like you can't teach dialogue because it's different every time out. You can't teach the sort of telling detail that makes you love a character, right? Like what are those moments that give you access to somebody? But structure can be taught and understood. Now, I never took a writing class or read a writing book. I mean, part of how I learned what structure was by reading, 5,000 books and watching 5,000 movies. I just love the form. But when I was first writing my first 2 books, I wrote the rough draft of my first novel, most of it when I was at Trinity College. When I was there, I was spending a lot of my time hammering out this rough draft, which frankly wasn't very good. It had a lot of bits and pieces, and I had to take it apart in the editing, almost like an engine block, and take all the pieces out and then reconstruct it and lay the structure on top of it, because that was the part that needed to order it. And I would say it wasn't even until my third book, which was a medical thriller called Do No Harm, that my rough draft was significantly closer to what the final draft would be. It was shaped properly like a book. So even having, spent so much of my life involved with stories, it still took some working, with my hands, up to the elbows in clay, to figure out how that worked. And then one of the things that's happened now, I mean, I'm writing, I don't know, maybe my 23rd, 24th book, and I've done a lot of scripts, is that the structure piece becomes almost subconscious. Like I'm never thinking about, it's like, if a lot of times if you have meetings with younger screenwriters, they'll use a lot of the catchphrases of like, well, now it's the, hero's reversal at the mid-second act point. And like, none of that for me is conscious. I have a sense of a story. I have a sense of how to move through it. It winds up having a structural, it doesn't mean that there aren't structural problems, some of which you've, skillfully pointed out to me when I've hit them, but it means that it's going to be shaped roughly the right way. I still might need to take a chisel to it. And so I'm always thinking first about the story and about the characters. That's all. It's got to grow from there. It's got to grow from that, not from a structure down. It can't be theoretical in reverse. And how I think of it is, you've seen those indoor rock climbing walls, right? That people climb. And I need to know that I have enough scenes to get myself across the wall. I need to know, like, here's a big chunky handhold I'm going to have somewhere in the third act towards the end of the book, right? Here's a bunch of stuff in the middle. I'm not sure when I reach them if I'm going to have to grab hold and get my moorings with my left hand or my right foot, but I have to know that there's enough there that this is going to constitute a full novel, right? And it's worth taking up, a year of my life, that there's enough to get me across that wall. And then a lot of it is discovered along the way as I write. There's a lot of other things that fill in ways that alter, and maybe that path across looks different. So the structural piece is essential. But fortunately now it runs like, it's almost like that's the background code. It's the ones and the zeros that I don't have to think about as much.
But it's the character that's driving you. Has that been a sort of realization as your writing has evolved? I mean, you said you did a sort of lot of work under the bonnet on the structure yourself in the first few books, but I remember you memorably telling me when we were asking me whether structure or character, plot or character was more important, and I said something I think probably pretty non-committal. They're both really important. You said no, it's all character. And the example you used to illustrate that was if you were in a bar and trying to get the barman's attention, and while this was going on, there was a TV screen on the wall showing the news, and there was something terrible happening on there to many people, you'd still be less upset about what was happening on the TV there than if the barman served somebody else before you. And that's because you're concerned most about character, and in that particular story, the character that matters most is you, of course. And I've remembered that because it is something which, particularly I think with thrillers, comes up a lot. People assume that it's having this sort of machine-tooled plot is more important than everything else, but it really is not. It's about the character. And I think you started with this Orphan X series by thinking more about the character than anything that happened subsequently. And you've sort of taken an archetype and you've made him your own. Can you tell me a little bit about how you went about that? Because it was a very sort of deliberate process designing Evan Smoke, wasn't it?
So I like that story because it makes me look utterly insensitive to the problems of the world as I'm waiting to get my pint.
No, so you were just trying to tell a story that I would understand, I think.
That's right. I had to make it relatable.
Yeah. If we beer into this, Roland will get it.
Yeah, that's right. So, well, a couple things, I mean, I think one of the pieces I think about a lot is with James Bond. You know, if you go to people and ask like, well, what's your favorite action sequence in, you know, Dr. No? It's not, people don't always relate necessarily even to the amazing action sequences or how the structure functions or like what the big turn is. But everybody knows how he takes his martini, right? Like the character flourishes. That's something that we could go out in the street and ask, you know, 100 people, and anybody familiar with James Bond is going to know that. They're going to know a lot of his tendencies and a lot of his characteristics. And ultimately, that's what gets people going back and returning. I mean, I think we've all been in those movies as movies have gotten kind of more action bloated, where you get into that never ending third act and you just feel like you're getting punched in the face with action again and again and again, and you've lost the thread. And so a lot of what to me defines the structure is when a character makes a particular choice that shifts the structure, like so that the character's journey is the thing that is motivating the structure of the story. And so you always have to be with them in that way. Now for Orphan X, I had the idea to write Orphan X years before I wrote it. And I think you know this because when we started, I mean, we did 2 or 3 books before we even got to Orphan X, but you knew Orphan X was there. And I was partially afraid to tackle it because I knew there's so many writers who I admire. I mean, there's in characters, right? I grew up with whether it's James Bond or Jason Bourne or Jack Reacher, there's so many characters who fill this role of sort of an archetypal hero, and they're all distinctive. And what I didn't want to do is write something that felt like it wasn't fully formed, where I could have something myself to say in a character who perhaps could someday be on a shelf with those other books that I grew up in that motivated me. And so there was a lot of pieces that fell into place with me about Evan Smoke, Orphan X. I mean, one of them was I knew that he was going to be taken out of a foster home and trained to be an assassin. Now that's a trope going back to Shakespeare, right? It's another thing that's very interesting is Shakespeare was always taking older narratives and polishing them. I mean, only The Tempest is wholly original, right? So The Merchant of Venice comes from The Jew of Malta, the same way that when Michael Connelly is writing, right, he's reaching back to Robert B. Parker, who's reaching back to Dashiell Hammett, right? There's always a tradition of certain themes, and this theme of a kid who's taken and trained to be an assassin that's not something that's wholly new. But I made a decision early on that what if instead of this just being purely traumatic and awful, which is usually how it's depicted, if the person who takes him out, it's simultaneously the best thing that ever happened to him, that his handler, the CIA handler who raises him, is the first person who gives this scrawny 12-year-old foster boy a father figure and gives him faith in his own humanity, even as he's being trained to do these awful things. So that was one piece for me. And the key line for me around which the whole series coalesces is when Evan's handler, his name is Jack Johns, when Evan is 12 years old, tells him, the hard part isn't going to be making you a killer. The hard part's going to be keeping you human. And that was the essential tension that's going to exist within him. And the other piece for me that was really important was that Evan, and one of the things that a lot of the readers have responded to, even more than I conceived of, is I wanted to create an archetypal character who also lives in the real world where you and I live. Excuse me. So Evan would go have these adventures. He'd get cut up. He'd do everything, but he'd come home to this building with a really annoying homeowners association where they're talking about adding new tiles in the lobby, and he's like bleeding through his shirt and he has to cover it. And he's moving among ordinary people with ordinary concerns. And I thought it's so interesting to take an archetypal character, and it's also really funny, and it helps to undercut his sort of sense of larger than lifeness, right? Because he still has to come home to the real world, and we never get to meet, like Dirty Harry doesn't have an awkward encounter by the mail slots at his apartment building. That's not part of how the plot functions, right? James Bond doesn't have to be figuring out how to make small talk with an elderly woman who is just, aggravating and irritable. And so there's this constant crossing over from him, from coming off something that's this amazing sort of 10% elevated from real life action sequence, and then landing in the real world with other people with real concerns. And I knew that would be part of his forging his way from being a killer, with the rules around that, meticulousness, perfection. He has OCD. Everything for him is like crystal clear and delineated. But part of that staying human is being involved with all the messiness and pettiness and shortcomings and also joys of humanity. And those are things that he's almost like he's a character who's thawing his way out of being an archetype into being a real person. And when I had those tensions set up, along with other habits as I got to know him, like his OCD, like his desire for cleanliness as a means of controlling what he can control, his obsession with high-end vodkas, which are the purest of all alcohols, then I knew I had a character that I could, not just spend the next year with, the majority of my waking hours, but the year after that and the year after that.
Are you finding that with each sort of successive book, you enjoy spending time with Evan kind of more and more? I mean, I've certainly found that, and I mean, that sort of feels like it's a privilege to have read all the books in the series and to have sort of built up this sort of greater sort of understanding and sort of impression of him, more three-dimensional impression. Is that something that you share and kind of look forward to deepening even more?
Yeah, I mean, I started with Orphan X, and he's very much a lone wolf, right? And he's got a few trusted contacts, and there's ways to weave it. But part of what's happened through the book series, which was not planned this meticulously, is he's drawn into kind of I want to say almost a makeshift family. Like there's people who start to move around him. The third book, I introduced a character called Josephine Morales. She goes by Joey. She's a 16-year-old Hispanic hacker. She's another orphan. She washed out from the program, unbelievably gifted. And the whole premise of that book is that Evan gets stuck with her as if on a babysitting mission, right? He resents it. It's something that Jack left him the care of in a way that was very indirect. And all he wants to do is get rid of her so he can complete the mission. But the real story of that book, the third book, which is called Hellbent, is really him losing his father figure in Jack and having to assume the responsibility for somebody else and become in a certain way like a father figure himself to somebody. And so that there's the narrative with the action and with the plot that's happening, but it's tied intricately to the fact that he's developing this sense of responsibility for this younger woman, who of course is difficult and tempestuous and can undermine him and makes fun of him, and she's always taking the piss. And like there's this whole dynamic between them that's very interesting. I was not planning to have her stick around. And she became such an integral voice. In fact, in the original outline, I was planning to have her die at the end of the book. And I just couldn't do it. She brought out so much in him. And it was so amazing what their interactions were, what I could say about the character, that I've kept around. She's a very important part of the series. And that's happened with a few other characters. And so as he kind of has thawed into a more complicated world away from the black and white rigors of the 10 commandments he lives his life by, the 10 assassins' commandments handed down to him from Jack Johns, there's more people in his life, which means that there's more mess and there's more emotional and moral considerations that he wasn't trained for, right? So we're constantly seeing him off his turf and being undermined. And that for me has been a lot of the joy and the humor in the series. And in fact, I was thinking about this. I don't think that I could go back and write another Orphan X book that's like Orphan X or The Nowhere Man, the first two. I think that time in the life of this story for me has passed. I
was just going to say, I think it sort of feels very much that's the case, in that when you come to an Orphan X novel now, it's Joey and it's Tommy Stojak, his armorer, and it's Mia and her son. I mean, it's the hinterland around him that has become as appealing, and his interactions with it as the lone wolf himself. And I wondered, I mean, this is something we talked about a little bit the other week, to what extent that presents a challenge for you as a writer writing a novel which some people might come to for the first time, even though you're 7 books in. You've got to somehow carry everything that's happened prior to that in a novel that needs to work on on its own merits as well.
It's funny because I think the answer to that is very similar to the conversation we we're having earlier about how we crassly label, but we all know what we mean, commercial fiction versus literary fiction. And the aim, of course, is not to choose. The aim is to be Dickens. The aim is to be Alfred Hitchcock, right? Where you're fulfilling the obligations of both. Of course, that's a life's work, and a lot of people spend their life and never attain that. I think it's a similar thing in writing a series, that the series writers who I admire the most, there's always a point for new readers to come in, but they're also evolving and changing. They're not writing the same book again and again and again. And so part of what I need to do is to have a jumping on point where it functions fully as a standalone, as a satisfying story on its own. But it's also evolving in terms of a larger narrative and larger story.
Gregg, I'm going to take a, and I'm not sure quite how much time we've got, but I was going to take a bit of a detour quickly, and really sort of based on that discovery the end of last week, that your thesis was on Shakespeare's Pericles, who is a man that I cannot claim any expertise in, but I have heard it said that he was to Athens what Julius Caesar was to Rome, and it seems interesting to me that you were, even at that time in your life, sort of interested in the life of a great statesman, because that's interest in politics and how the world works and how things are run has become sort of increasingly important to you of late, as you've kind of written for, advised the Democratic Party as well. I mean, they're sort of, I don't know, what would the question be? What could the Democrats learn from Pericles, and should they?
Boy, that's a question that needs a 17-part answer. I think a lot of what we're grappling with here, and it's funny, I was just on a phone call kind of contending with this, and I think a lot of what you're grappling with in England as well, a lot of the countries is politics fundamentally. I think people, part of why I was so obsessed and found Jung so compelling is the notion that storytelling, story recognition, it's a fundamental human trait. It's like opposable thumbs and eyelids, right? You can find a tribe who is cut off from any other civilization in the middle of the Amazon. If you find them, they're going to have eyelids, opposable thumbs, and they will have a hero story. Every culture has a hero story, and I believe it is as selected for as biological traits, right? Or genetic traits in a lot of ways. It's a selection process. We function with narrative. And a lot of it, I think that the sort of uber answer to what you're saying is we're increasingly fragmented from a shared narrative, whether as a country in America, I think you guys are dealing with this also. There's a fragmentation of what are our shared aspects of culture? What are our shared aspects as a nation, right? What is the story that we're going to tell? And there's a lot of ways that those get evolved. I mean, social media has a hugely it just sort of fractures any notion of narrative. People can increasingly select, it's almost like gerrymandering in the US, where they choose these very intricate districts so that they can carve out only all the Democrats or all the Republicans for a rep, so that Congress people can keep getting elected again and again. But then they're representing fewer and fewer constituents across the band of what they're supposed to be doing. So we keep sending people to DC who have to represent and answer to a more radicalized base or a more uniform base. We're having trouble agreeing on what fundamental facts are, let alone stories. And I think that the biggest thing that is responsibility that I've been trying to work on with the Democrats, and more fundamentally for America, is what's a shared story that we can relate to? What's a shared set of morals and facts that we can agree with? What's a way that we can tell the story of who we are as a people and as a country without falling into all these traps that seem to define it? And so everything for me comes back to storytelling.
Yeah. Well, that's it seems to me that that's a pretty good place to perhaps kind of bring Gregg and my to and fro to an end. In that I was going to sort of finish off by asking whether or not there was any particular advice or insights that kind of you had taken from your time at Trinity that had sort of stayed with you. But it seems we've gone back to the beginning of the conversation, and whichever way I come at it, the answer is always going to be the importance of storytelling.
I'll tell you something else with Trinity. Like, one of the things I say, I grew up in California, but I went to school on the East Coast. And I never knew how much of a Californian I was till I went to school on the East Coast. I also never knew how fundamentally American I was till I went to school in England. And I loved it. I mean, as you know, like I'm back there, you know, I've spent a lot of time in a lot of different places throughout England together. And I completely love it. But it was so interesting to see the contrasts in so many different ways. And I don't think I ever would have experienced that as fully had I not lived there and been educated there and seen, like, it's such a foil to all the things that we take for granted. You know, it's like a fish not knowing what water is, you know. So in a lot of ways, going to first the East Coast for me and meeting people all around the world. And I grew up in a very diverse background in California and in the, you know, the San Francisco Bay Area. But going to Trinity College was just an amazing experience for me, because I was submerged in something where, you know, I was not only the minority, but a lot of my habits and a lot of my tendencies and a lot of my personality weren't necessarily the status quo. And so it was captivating and amazing. So I'd say that's the other piece, the importance of story and, you know, all you people teaching me how American I was.
You know, we can rely on us to keep doing that.
That's true.
As well as sort of sharing some other sort of cul-de-sacs of Britishness, which you may not yet have discovered, and possibly want to keep at arm's length. But we'll have to get you over again as soon as possible to continue that education.
Agreed.
So I think Sarah, were you going? Should we invite questions from people who've been listening?
Yes. Sorry, I've been joined by my son here. As
yeah, no, that's good. That's great. I mean, the audience is growing and growing. Does he have a question?
I've got a question. If other people have questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask it, or put it in the chat, whichever you prefer. My question, Greg, although I have only so far managed to read one book, I do plan to read the rest. It seems like it would be the right sort of thing that would do really well as a film. Has it been optioned as a film, or would you consider that at all? Or
it was in fact optioned as a film, and I did the adaptation for feature a while back. We sold it and went to Bradley Cooper. It was right off American Sniper, and we only went to him because I wanted somebody who could reach those two sides of Evan Smoke, right? The kind of toughness and grit of American Sniper and the sort of humanity from Silver Linings Playbook. And so that was a big part of it. I wrote the adaptation, and then I lost him to A Star Is Born, which he wrote, produced, started, and directed. And so that's a lot of what happens with Hollywood and in development is it's like everything needs to come together at the precisely correct moment. And sometimes you have the right actor, but then you lose them due to a schedule. And so then at a point I got the rights back. I was playing with it to develop it for television. And one of the things that I realized in that process, it's funny, going back to something Roland and I talked about. So I wrote a TV pilot. I've had all sorts of different conversations with different actors and people attached. And the last realization that I came to was, I don't think that I can solely adapt it myself in some ways, because where I am in the life and the universe of the story is at a further point. And I was reaching back in, you know, when I did the first adaptation, it was still pretty close to Orphan X, the first book being out. So I did an adaptation of Orphan X. But as I was playing with it and wrote a pilot, I wrote a couple different versions of the pilot. What I realized was I was trying to kind of take the heightened sophistication or complexity I knew of the character now. We were kind of taking the plot from Hellbent, but I had to do all the setup from Orphan X as I was writing forward in the books. And I just realized it was too jumbled. And so part of what I've done now is just I have the rights back. And I'm just sort of waiting to see for when the right organic opportunity is going to present itself with somebody who sees it and gets the series, and also someone who can take the football and run with it a little bit, because I'm increasingly realizing that I can't be as immersed as I am in his story in the novels moving forward and be reaching back as much more than as a consultant or as a creator. So it's a different relationship that I think I need to have in it. And right now I'm kind of regrouping to do that. But I do hope at some point that will come to fruition, but I'm no longer kind of pressing that forward.
Thank you. That makes total sense. Like trying to, and have you got lots more books sort of planned out already? Or does that happen sort of organically when you get to the end of one?
Yeah, well, I have the next book is called Dark Horse, and that comes out in February. And that's the next Orphan X book. And I am currently working away on the one that will follow that. So right now on the novel side, it's all Orphan X all the time. I've been enjoying it very much. So, and I don't have any plans to get off that particular track, because I keep finding new things to do with the character. And as long as I can find things that keep me as engaged as I feel when I'm writing them, if I'm interested and engaged when I'm writing it, then people will feel that way, I think, when they're reading it. That's the hope, at least. And I'm noticing no diminishing of that right now in my writing.
Cool, thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Oh, Neil looks like he hasn't.
Gregg, lovely to listen to you. I just wondered, whenever you start writing a book, do you think far ahead and think, I've got 5 or 6 books I could write about this? Or do you think, let's just take one at a time and see how it settles and see how the readers like it?
Oddly, it's sort of as a combination of both. And that when I think I waited so long for Orphan X to write it, because I knew it would be a series. I knew once I wrote that, I'd want to stay with that character, but I really took my time waiting to see when I could have all the pieces to keep it sufficiently engaging for me, right? But that said, when I first pitched this, I told Roland, we had a conversation, because here and with my editor in the United States, and I threw out an idea of a future Orphan X book that is the plot of the 6th Orphan X book called Prodigal Son. Evan has a phone that rings. It's an untraceable number that people who are in some horrible life and death predicament can call him, and he will help them pro bono, now having left the orphan program. And I said, at one point that phone's going to ring and he's going to answer it, and someone on the other end is going to say, Evan, it's your mother. And I didn't know anything more than that, but I just knew at some point when he answers that phone, that is his only sort of contact with the world, that this kid who grew up in a foster home system, who never knew his biological parents, that at some point that phone ring would be his mother. And Roland loved that. My agent in the United States was all lit up. I mean, this was before Orphan X. It took me 6 books to get there. But it was a notion that I had to build to. I had to have them developed to a certain extent. And so sometimes there's these notions that are swimming around and they solidify. It's almost like as I push through and clarify what I'm writing in this Uber arc of the story of Evan Smoke, the things that are further along come into focus as I do it. And now and then when I've been really worried, if I'm writing a book and I don't think that I have I'm not sure what's going to be next, there's always a point like halfway through the writing of that manuscript or 2/3 through that all of a sudden I'll know what the next book is. And it's always terrifying to think that hasn't come or it's not gonna come, but so far it always has. So I have a lot of gratitude for that. It's one of the weird aspects of being a writer is that it can't be duplicated. No line of dialogue, no story. And you don't always know where it comes from. So there's this sort of constant anxiety when you're writing that what if I just wake up and nothing works? Like nothing has any magic to it anymore, And that notion of what the next plots are, sometimes there's these vague shapes, but you need them to kind of resolve in a lot of ways. And when they resolve fully and properly, and when I can if I can manage to get out of the way of the story, they sometimes will assume a shape that almost feels inevitable, if that makes any kind of sense. Like it was always there waiting for me. I just had to like puzzle and think and grind my way to seeing it in its proper form.
Okay.
In the chat, Stephen has read that he loves reading the Orphan X books, and he sort of asked the same thing as me. Do you see it stretching into the future? And you've already answered that yes, as long as you keep having the ideas, then it will keep going, which is great. So let's hope they keep coming.
And he was asking about some favorite thriller writers.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a number of favorite thriller writers. Of course, someone who I love, so sort of more similar to my writing, or to the kind of stuff that I write. I'm a big fan of Dennis Lehane, Mystic River, Shutter Island. He's wonderful. Robert Crace is wonderful. He's ranged from everything from like a first person detective to writing like big knockdown thrillers. He's had a lot of interesting range, and I think has really pushed himself to write different things in his career. I have a great deal of admiration for Lee Child. I think he's managed to keep a kind of humor and light touch and like blue collar intellectualism, right? Like Lee is so bright. He's so smart. And there's a real intelligence that he infuses in the books while also managing it with such a light touch. And there's a crime fiction writer called Megan Abbott, who I'm a huge fan of. And everything that she writes feels like I'm just completely immersed in the story. I mean, I could go on and on, but there's a great number of people who I look at and admire. Another person who I actually came to a little bit later and of course, Raymond Chandler, of course, and James M. Cain, but Robert B. Parker, I love. He did the Spencer series, which was popularized in TV show Spencer for Hire. And what's amazing with him is he was one of the first people to really write into that kind of humanity that I'm talking about, where Spencer's a PI, but he has a girlfriend and he cooks and he's got all sorts of personal interests. And there's a real strong like moral undercurrent that feels a little bit more contemporary than in some of the past writers. Okay, so you have a question from Lauren Crace. Hello, Lauren. The geography of Los Angeles seems to serve as another character in your novels. Would you consider revisiting Oxford in some narrative form? I would indeed. I've gotten as far as referencing in the books with some of the vodka drinking, the bar at the Savoy in London, which is my, maybe one of my favorite bars aside from Duke's in the world. But I would love to get back up there. And I've been, anywhere that I travel, it's one of the really entertaining things with Orphan X is that he's traveled, having killed people on all the continents, right? And had these vast travels as Orphan X. There's a level of traveled sophistication to him, even if it's not urbane the way that James Bond is, that he can travel and go to all sorts of locations. He's familiar with all sorts of languages and cultures, and he can fit in with a lot of that in ways that are compelling and interesting to me. So I don't ever feel like I'm limited with where I can take him. A lot of the inspiration for the ways that he views the world is, I have a lot of, when I'm out here, I've some friends who are Navy SEALs or, recon Marines. And for me, my friends are my friends. I always have a very sort of democratic mix and blend of people at the house. And a lot of times I'll have friends who are, like very educated from that set. And then I'll have a friend who's a demolition breacher staying at the house. And one of the things I've always found is that if somebody is passionate about their field, the amount of overlap conversationally, like a lot of people would be concerned that would get awkward or people are from different walks of life. But there's so much overlap in terms of if I have one of my Navy SEALs friends talking with a friend of mine, maybe from Oxford or from the East Coast or someone who's in finance, because they'll talk about travel, they'll talk about language, they'll talk about, I had one friend who was a big photographer, was talking about lenses. And my friend who was a sniper, of course, knows everything about lenses. It's just like, it's arriving at the same topics through different angles. And so that's a lot of the fun that I have with Evan is that a lot of times I can bring in things that I might have approached from or been exposed to culturally or academically that he's been exposed to, in figuring out how he can blend in culturally based on the etiquette of certain countries, right? Or what are the habits, or what's the cuisine? And so there's aspects of him where, in a lot of ways, I think of him as a Renaissance man, but without any pretension, because he comes from it's the pure practice of living and dealing with different places and people and cultures that informs that. And it's also highly strategic if that's a skill that someone can master. The more cultures you can understand, the more conversations and languages that you're fluent in, the more strategic is your place in the world. And that's one of the things that builds him. So sure, he could show up at Oxford and have all sorts of adventures.
That sounds, yes, let's hope for Evan Smoke coming to Oxford in the future. I've got another question if other people haven't got questions. Your screenwriting and Orphan X, how do you juggle the two? How do you spend time on both of them? How much time do you spend writing for the screen and taking the projects? How do you get into the projects for the screenwriting? That's two questions in one, I think.
It's a good question. It's very tricky, and there's no kind of science to it. You know, I tend to do better if I can put my head down on a project and write for a long time. And so I don't typically write like books in the morning and scripts in the afternoon, which some people do. I tend to be really focused on a book. And then if I have a rewrite on a script or something, I'll put it down and I'll just be very focused on getting through that rewrite for the screenplay also. And it has different demands. Like if I'm on, at times when I've been working in TV production, that takes precedent. I mean, if there's not a script, an entire microeconomy shuts down, for $400,000 a day. There's just not an option for it. And so the demands kind of ebb and flow. I mean, one of the things I like to be out a bit ahead on the novels in terms of the schedule, so that if some opportunity arises that's really undeniably fun to do a comic or to do a pilot or to do a screenplay, then I have the room to do that. Or if I'm needed to be on location to shoot a movie, I'm not going to be getting a ton of rough draft novel writing time in. But I've learned to be pretty efficient with my time. So I try and jump between projects, but be able to be fully immersed in them for stretches rather than kind of chopping up the day. Unless I'm editing, right? So if I'm editing, I can tinker a bit on a rewrite here and fix some things there. Like right now I have edits on a manuscript that I'm working on, and that gives me a bit more flexibility to pop in and out of other projects versus rough draft writing where it has to be your whole world. It has to be everything you're thinking about and sleeping and eating.
On that sort of note, how do you manage like the writing and life? Like, I mean, obviously writing is your life, but like, if you have a really brilliant idea in the middle of a garden party with your friends or something, how do you manage that sort of remembering it for later? Do you just write it down?
Yeah, I always have a notepad. I always write stuff down. I'm trying to figure out how to be less distractible, but somebody once said that being a writer is like having homework for the rest of your life. And it sort of feels that way. There's never a time where I'm like, oh, all my, reports are in, I can go on holiday for 3 weeks. And because it's not just the way that I perceive the world. I literally am thinking in stories, but anytime if I'm observing somebody on a train, or I bump into somebody, or somebody has a particular accent or observation, I'm always collecting those things. And I like collecting people too. Anyone who is really passionate about something or devoted to something. I tend to like people who have any particular interest. It doesn't matter what it is, but if they're very focused in it, I'm always interested in the ways that people burrow towards excellence and exceptionalism. Is one of the great benefits, of course, of being at Trinity College is you're surrounded with people who are devoted to those kinds of interests, but you can find them anywhere. You can find people from all walks of life. And so I do feel like there's part of me that is always on call.
It must be pretty tough, but if it's what you love doing, then it's
it is. David, did you have a question?
Looks like.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for that, Greg. I mean, I found it all fascinating and very illuminating. Sitting here in LA myself, I'm being also in the business. I was fascinated what you said about Hollywood and how we as creators manage to combine the commercial needs with more interesting, wider interests and philosophies, really. And I think your example of how Shakespeare did it so well it was particularly illuminating. I'm sorry, I'm rambling. I think what my question is, how much have you been influenced and how much have you tried to avoid the superhero genre and everything that's gone on in Hollywood in the last 5 years? And do you feel that you've learned anything from that? Do you feel you've benefited, or have you tried to avoid a lot of the commercial madness of it?
That's a very interesting question. And boy, how times have changed. So I was a comic book geek as a kid. Like in 7th grade, I was reading The Punisher. And what's interesting is I broke into comics with Marvel years ago now. And I was given an offer, the proverbial offer you can't refuse. The editor-in-chief was a fan of some of my books, which tend to deal with vigilantism. And he let me choose any character from the Marvel vaults. So I wrote The Punisher. I moved on and wrote Moon Knight. I wrote some Wolverine. And then DC came in and they made me a similar offer, and I crossed over there and I wound up writing Batman for a number of years. And early on, this was really before the superhero genre exploded in Hollywood. There was every TV show and it was so commercialized. And in some ways, I sort of scratched that itch sufficiently on the comic side to not want to dive into it on the screenwriting side as much. And so when I first was going to Comic-Con, even, it was all about the creators and the booths and the drawing. And as the years progressed with me going back to Comic-Con, part of what happened was it felt more and more like work, because I would go there and the studios would have booths and they would be marketing The Walking Dead. And it started to feel like Comic-Con became more like Hollywood rather than being this little bailiwick for all of us nerds who grew up with and loved it and played with it. And so in a lot of ways, I think I was ending my exposure to that world as everyone started to sort of earnestly rev it up on the Hollywood front. But I still work with a company that I'm on the creative council for in comics, and I can pretty much write whatever it is that I want for them. And so I'm doing a new comic called Knighted, which I'm sort of deconstructing the notion of superheroes. I'm kind of coming at it from a very different angle, which is of interest. Once I spend a lot of time with something, I like to kind of deconstruct it and play with it from different ways and hit it from different angles. And so that's more what my focus is now than trying to write another go-ahead superhero movie and trying to break in that way.
Sorry, I got distracted there. Sorry, I heard the last of that. It's interesting. I mean, just to take up one of your earlier points about Shakespeare, how he managed to play to the whole audience so brilliantly. Of course, he had the advantage of feedback from that audience. We don't, with a book or with a film or with a TV show, we don't have that advantage that Shakespeare had. So maybe there's a way that one can, as TV and film and literature develops, is there some way we can bring that feedback more? Is it through social media?
Well, I think in some ways we suffer from a surfeit of a different kind of feedback now, which is, 24/7 social media. I mean, I remember when I was producing a TV show, it's constant what people's feedback is week to week, and you can almost get lost in it, and there's a point where you stop, as a writer, you stop reading all the Amazon reviews. I mean, there's just like thousands of them at a certain point. So it's this weird difference where Shakespeare could receive feedback in real time and see what's working in the play to adjust it. But in some ways it's endless and bottomless now. And so I've had to actually take steps to kind of pare back the amount that I read, and look, I've been fortunate in that most of the feedback and reviews that I've gotten have been positive, but you can't believe all those either, or like people don't always know what it is that they like or they want to see. Like if people are disappointed or they love something, they might like that disappointment. They might like having that argument and discussion. And it's like we're weirdly privy to a lot of the intimate workings of fans and what they think about and feel. And so I've tried to kind of narrow the choke on the shotgun a bit. I do read reviews, but I have a pretty trusted internal team at this point. I have a spectacular agent, both in the US and in the UK, and I have editors who, to some extent, I really chose as much as they chose me, both in Roland and my editor in the US. And so I have kind of an inner cabal of people where I can get a lot of the feedback that I think is essential. There's a lot of different views that are represented, and I try not open it up too wide beyond there. And so my rule of thumb always is when writers are starting out, I say, you know, and they're in writing groups and they're online and they're sharing, it's a lot of stuff. I said, look, pick people whose creative trust, whose creative abilities and insights you trust, but then you have to listen to them. It should be a smaller number. And it doesn't mean that you take their advice exactly, because a lot of what, as you know, you mentioned that you're in the industry. A lot of times when somebody puts down a note on a script, if you get a note from an executive and they say, this is really sluggish right here, and it's in the third act, that's just when they happen to think that and write it down. It could be because there's first act problems, right? It could be that so you never want to prove them wrong if you have trusted interlocutors. But what you want to do is sort of excavate the underlying editorial anxiety that they have. And so there's ways, I think, of trying to engage with this sort of influx of information and input that it's a sort of responsibility of a contemporary writer who wants to have commercial success to figure out how to filter it and also how to listen to it and how to engage with it in ways that are fruitful without losing your own focus and the own filter of your voice.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There don't seem to be any other questions in the chat. I've run out of my questions. Does anyone else have any questions?
Actually, I've got one more question if there's time. Sorry, I don't want to.
I think so. Is there time, Greg? Are you?
Yeah, let's do one more. Sure.
Yeah. How do you deal with the nature of evil in your work and the classic villains and so on? You mentioned the 70 deadly sins, and there's there's the fury and other things, of course. I mean, how do you deal with that? I mean, how do you deal with balancing the heroism with that? Has it been a problem? Has it become easier as you become more experienced?
That's a superb question. It's become harder and more complicated because I think when I started, I was very young. You know, I started my first novel, I was 19. And I think I wrote back then heroes and villains. And I don't write heroes and villains anymore. I write antagonists and protagonists. And for me, the biggest point of interest is I used to think that like the more evil that the bad guy was, the more heroic and good the good guy would seem. And increasingly, I've learned that that's not the case at all. I want to write antagonists who have a worldview that we can really relate to, that it should confound and confuse us. It should, in a lot of ways, a biggest point, and more overtly in the new book coming out, Dark Horse, the antagonist in that is much more specifically this. But I think a lot of Milton's Lucifer, right? Like the intellect that falls in love with itself, and then believes that it can be without moral bearings in some ways. That's a source of fascination for me. And if I can find an antagonist who has a point of view that some dark, deep streak of me agrees with or wants to give into or can be convinced by, that's very compelling. And likewise, one of the things that I've learned is that with my protagonists, Evan being one of them, Evan isn't always, he makes missteps, right? He's not always kind and open. And one of the things I've realized is that when my protagonists stumble, when they give in to something based on, with him quite often, it's sort of the strictures of his upbringing give him a sort of harshness, or if people impinge on his space, he can be very sort of vehemently protective in ways that might seem unrelatable. But I think that audience and readers like relate to it, because what can you relate to more than somebody who who makes a mistake and feels badly for it, but feels incapable of correcting it immediately as a characterological trait. That's all the things that we contend with. That's the most human aspect of things in a lot of ways. And so I've tried to make my antagonists more compelling and more complicated and more alluring in some ways, and making my protagonists increasingly have to grapple with the issues of gray that lie between the poles of black and white, because that's where all the mess takes place. And it's more challenging every time, but also more rewarding every time that I try and do that.
No, thank you.
Hmm.
Well, I think we've taken up about an hour of your time, Greg. Your very precious writing time.
That's great. That was wonderful. Thank you. I'm glad everyone showed up, and I appreciate all the thoughtful questions. And Sarah, thank you for hosting me. And Roland, always a pleasure to talk, to have an excuse for us to talk extracurricularly here.
Yeah, great to have the opportunity. Thank you, Sarah.
No, it's been absolutely great. Thank you so much, Greg and Roland.